Early one morning, in the summer of 1997, a man is going for a walk in Kälers Park in Sweden. It's a popular green spot, a mountainous area overlooking the city of Gothenburg. The man has been there before, but this time he diverts from his ordinary route and decides to ascend some stairs leading up to a secluded old water tower higher up on the hills. As he approaches the tower, he notices a drunk man sleeping on the ground next to the tower. But walking closer, he finds that something seems odd about this sleeping stranger. But it's not until he comes up right beside him that he can see that the man has been shot in the back and head and is dead. But now you may be wondering, what has all that got to do with this woman, who is convinced that she is pregnant with and going to give birth to the child of Satan? We will get to that shortly. But first, let's return again to the wanderer in the park. He rushes to the nearest telephone kiosk to dial the police. When police and forensic investigators arrive at the scene, the dead man has no driver's license or other means of identification on him, so it's not until after a couple of days that police manage to identify the man as a homosexual Algerian man named Joseph. Near the water tower, the police find a belt and hat belonging to Joseph's ex-boyfriend. He is therefore arrested and detained as a suspect in the case, but after almost 2 weeks he is released from detention as the police don't find anything substantial to tie him to the case. So the police become frustrated. The investigation comes to a halt as they have absolutely no leads on the case, no clues to investigate. That's when something unexpected happens. A woman, Sarah, calls the police to report her boyfriend for assault and unlawful threat. He has assaulted her with scissors and knives, threatened to throw her in front of the subway train, to kill her unborn child and force her to eat it. She fears for her life as she knows what her boyfriend is capable of. In fact, he has told her how he recently murdered a person in Gothenburg, providing her with several details of the crime. He is also the leader of a violent satanic sect called Epilogue, the misanthropic Luciferian order. As Sarah relays all this to the police, they realize that her boyfriend was likely involved in the murder in Kälers Park. But how did Sarah find out about this murder? Well, it turns out that while she and her boyfriend Nemesis was out in town one night, they saw a headline about the killing. Nemesis then whispered to her, "We killed the fag." Later, they also saw a Swedish television show called Wanted. It was a popular show where police appealed to viewers to call in and leave clues they might have about unsolved cases. The episode Sarah and Nemesis watched was about the killing in Gothenburg, and according to Sarah, Nemesis seemed very stressed and nervous when the case was brought up. So in the middle of December in 1997, police arrest Nemesis in his home. He's carrying a loaded gun with a bullet in the chamber. When they raid his home, they find several items related to his Satanist beliefs. Among them, a VHS tape with a recording from Norwegian television, where he explains how they want to lure young people interested in black metal into joining the Epilogue. He has also been on Swedish television before as a spokesperson for Satanism, describing how we don't give a shit about paganism or Nordic religion, all we care about is Satan and death. According to Sarah, Nemesis had not killed Joseph on his own, but with the help of his good friend Jon. Not only is Jon a member of the Epilogue, he's also the frontman of the successful black metal band Dissection. Dissection had actually become quite successful within the black metal scene, but for various reasons the band had split up during the summer the same year. In any case, 2 days later, the police also arrest Jon and search his home. Some of the things they find include a sawed-off shotgun, a satanic altar with various occult and satanic imagery, bloody knives, a skull, black candles, and a bloody axe with fur on it that had been used to sacrifice animals. They also find a list of names of people who have left the Epilogue and become the enemy of the organization. But one item that stands out is an Epilogue flyer intended for internal distribution, and it reads as follows. Greetings, brothers and sisters. You are now holding the final message from Epilogue Warlord Gothenburg. The time has come for the first attack and everything has been prepared to the last detail. Those who were to be chosen are chosen, and we have received clearance from our almighty Lord Satan. So, after all humiliation it is meant to live among the human swine, we have now reached the state of satanic blessing, where we are allowed to enter the kingdom of our Lord. So, brothers and sisters, rejoice with us and know that your time is nigh. Some of the unbelievers who have been chosen as the sacrifices that will open the gate are already known to you since our last meeting. I want to remind you that if any of those marked for death have escaped our attack, it is of highest importance that all available means are used to eliminate these traitors. Hopefully, this will not be necessary, since we are to do everything in our power to deal with these individuals on our own. Distribution of weapons and money has by the time you read this already taken place. Some of you might feel that the distribution was unjust, but after deeper consideration you will realize that those who needed most support have received it, in the same way that the warrior group has received the most of the weapon stash. The economically responsible sections are now tasked with the full responsibility of making sure the warrior group are both trained and armed for the attack that will follow ours. All MLO section leaders in Scandinavia and Europe, as well as our American allies in the 4P movement, have been informed about the change in leadership that has taken place and the further changes that this will cause. I want to again point out to those security measures that were discussed at the latest meetings. It is also very important that all groups lay low the months following our section's final sacrifice. No contact is to be re-established between you before your new MLO warlord contacts all group leaders for a new ground meeting. There's not much more to add, as I have already personally spoken to all group leaders. Now I want you to remember us, MLO Misanthropic Legion, with darkness in the heart, and I hope you will be strengthened and inspired by our sacrifice. May our almighty Lord Sataniel's shadow guard you. Pray for our souls. Pacarimos fodos camortet inferno feximos pactum, by our agreement with death and our pact with hell. Hail Satan. Signed MLO Warlord, Blood Nemesis Nemidial. So the police interrogations begin. And remember that while in detention, neither Nemesis nor Jon were allowed to communicate with each other or the outside world. They have no information about the investigation against them. And if they receive any bits and pieces of information from the police, it's only as a means to get them to open up and talk. Anyway, Nemesis is interrogated a few days before Christmas. He says that Sarah is lying, that she has mental health problems and is out of her mind. He admits to having bought the gun, but denies having anything to do with the murder. He even denies that he was at the scene of the murder at all. A few weeks later, a couple of days after New Year, police tell Nemesis that Jon is also detained and that he has confessed that both he and Nemesis were involved in the killing. Suddenly, the police have Nemesis' full attention, as he is very curious about whether Jon really did rat him out. So he admits to Jon being his friend, but demands to know more about what his friend has said before giving any further details. The police tell Nemesis that Jon has left a 35-page statement, but gleefully refuse to provide him with any further details. After some consideration, Nemesis explains that it was Jon who brought the gun and that he is disappointed that Jon got him into all this. He tells the police that they in fact did meet Joseph on the night in question, but he claims that he himself did leave Jon at some point, after which he did not meet him again until the next day. Jon then told him that he had attacked Joseph with a stun gun and shot him in the back and head. Throughout several interrogations, Nemesis maintains that he was never present at the scene. Jon also denies the allegations of murder. He admits to possession of some guns and weapons, but says that he only had those because he felt threatened by rival Satanist groups. He explains quite openly to the police how he and Nemesis met Joseph while they were out on town, how Joseph was a pain in the ass who followed them around, and that they planned to kill him, but didn't know when would be a suitable time, and therefore had let Joseph follow them home. He says they then went to the park where Nemesis attacked Joseph with a stun gun and then shot him with the railgun, and that they viewed it as a sacrifice to Satan. Jon maintains this story during his second interrogation, but in January of 1998 he suddenly takes the entire blame on himself, and now claims that it wasn't a planned murder, but that it nevertheless was he who had fired both shots. The reason being because Joseph was a faggot who had followed them around and tried to hit on them. And then, in February, he changes his story again. He now claims that he dropped the gun at the scene and that Nemesis had picked it up and fired both shots at Joseph. He also mentions that he, just a couple of days before the murder, had found out that Sarah was pregnant and that she and Nemesis planned to live as a family. One peculiar thing that he for some reason wishes to tell the police is how he, during a trip to his friends in Norway, was told that one black metal musician had shot himself in the head with a shotgun, and that another member of the same band had collected pieces from the skull and even made a stew with parts of the brain. Police then interrogate a couple who had been part of the MLO but left the organization. In addition to having been a member of the MLO, the man had also been the guitarist in the band Dissection. The couple both explain how Nemesis, a couple of weeks before the murder, began talking about how the organization needed to carry out a human sacrifice to show their faith in Satan. More specifically, they claim that Jon and Nemesis had talked openly about how the MLO should lure people to the apartment, sacrifice them to Satan, after which everyone present would commit ritual suicide. So, all these findings, the MLO organization, the rituals, and Nemesis' grand plans of death naturally lead the prosecutor to pursue the line that the killing of Joseph was a Satanist ritual murder, and in the early summer of 1998, the investigation is finished and the prosecutor formally filed the indictment against Jon and Nemesis. The trial and main hearing is held at the Gothenburg District Court in June. As the trial begins, Sarah is heard early, as she is not only a witness in the murder case, but also a victim in relation to the charges of assault and unlawful threat that Nemesis is facing. Sarah begins by describing how she met Nemesis. It was in 1997 through the Gustafsson brothers, dubbed the Heavy Metal Brothers after a classic segment on Swedish state television. They had a common interest in Satanism and occultism, and after receiving her number, Nemesis called her on the phone and told her about his organization, the MLO, and she subsequently traveled to Gothenburg to meet him. Nemesis there introduced Jon to her as his brother. They all slept in Jon's apartment, and in August she moved in with Nemesis in Gothenburg. They became a couple, and she also joined the MLO. She, Jon, and Nemesis held several rituals. During some of these rituals, the before-mentioned couple also participated. She is now pregnant with Nemesis' child. But regarding the assault that she reported, their phone call to the police that started the whole thing, well, now she takes it all back. She made it all up because she was angry and disappointed with Nemesis. She had heard that he did cheat on her with some girl and wanted revenge. That's why she called the police. After realizing that he in fact did not cheat on her, she has no reason to lie anymore. The only thing that was true was that he slapped her sometime in December in 1997 in the subway, the reason being that she inquired too much about some rumors. As for the rest of the trial, the prosecutor decides to split the evidence in two parts, focusing first on the MLO and the relationship between those involved, and then the evidence related to the actual murder. So, we return to the couple I mentioned earlier. The man has known Jon since the 80s because they play music together. He and his girlfriend got to know Nemesis through Jon. Nemesis has no interest in music, but is extremely knowledgeable about Satanism and is very dominant in his leadership of the MLO. Nemesis makes all decisions in the organizations. He actually had a dispute with Nemesis because he wanted to leave the MLO but keep playing in Dissection, which Nemesis didn't like. And it is true that Nemesis had been talking for some time about human sacrifice. According to his girlfriend, Jon did everything Nemesis asked him to do. He had Jon wrapped around his finger. At one point during a ritual at Jon's place, she and her boyfriend received a glass with magic powder, which turned out to be amphetamines. She confirms to the court that Nemesis really did talk about luring people to the apartment to kill them and about blowing up schools. Another man, a musician from the melodic black metal band Sacramentum, explains how he joined the MLO in 1995, but that he decided to leave the organization because of Nemesis' style of leadership. When he defected, Nemesis threatened him and gave him 1 month to remove his MLO tattoo. And then it's time for Nemesis and Jon to give their testimonies. They talk first about why they kept changing their stories during the preliminary investigation, then about the MLO and the relationship, and then finally about what happened at the night of the murder. So, what does Jon say? Well, a couple of days before Christmas, he heard that Nemesis got caught with the gun and that Sarah had snitched. And he knew that his fingerprints might be on a pack of cigarettes that Joseph had. The police also insisted that they knew what had happened. He therefore assumed that they were already fucked and that he was the only one denying the charges. So he lied that it was planned because he didn't want anyone to find out about the homosexual stuff because that's such a humiliating thing to be subjected to. The reason he said earlier that he was a sacrifice to Satan was because Nemesis told him afterwards that it could be viewed like that. He held a tough attitude just to be able to deal with everything that had happened, and after a while he realized that he only made things worse by lying that the murder was planned, and therefore chose to reveal the truth about the homosexual aspect. He also felt a big responsibility for how everything turned out, since he was the one who brought the gun. Nemesis is his brother, and he felt guilty even though he wasn't the one who fired the gun. He later realized that Nemesis had not confessed as he initially thought. He became anxious and realized that he had just made everything worse for Nemesis by what he said. And that is why he, in January, decided to take all the blame on himself and lie that he fired both shots. Nemesis is his brother, and they both believe that means that you should protect each other. When he finally heard about how police made a breakthrough in the interrogation of Nemesis, he interpreted that as if Nemesis had confessed to the truth, namely that Nemesis fired both shots. It was unthinkable for him that Nemesis would attempt to save himself by shifting the blame on someone else, and therefore in February he figured that he could also just tell the truth as it was. He has so much respect for Nemesis that he would never dare to lie about him, but he is completely baffled by the fact that Nemesis and Sarah apparently have decided to still be a couple. But how does Nemesis explain changing his story during the course of the investigation? In the beginning he just said a bunch of stuff to protect Jon. That's why he confessed to having brought the gun. He did not want to be a witness in a trial against Jon. That's why he said that he wasn't even at the scene. He's bound by honor and by principle don't want to say much until he knows the full situation. That's why he tried to get more information about Jon had said before making his own statement. If Jon wants to talk, that's okay, as long as he doesn't try to blame Nemesis. When Jon betrayed him, when a friend lets you down like that, well, from that point on, normal rules don't apply anymore. From that moment, the person is no longer a friend, but an enemy. He speculates that the reason Jon changed his story was actually because he got mad when he heard that he was together with Sarah again and that they were getting married. Jon is probably angry about this since Sarah was the one who snitched about the murder to the police. So then it's time for Jon to say something about Nemesis, their friendship and the MLO. For many years he's been active in a band playing so-called black metal. The name of the group is Dissection, and they have had some success. The man from the couple mentioned earlier was part of the same group. Together with music also came an interest in Satanism. He first came in contact with Satanism in 1992, and also have several friends in the Norwegian black metal scene, including an organization called the Black Circle. It is the darker aspects of religion that inspire the music. Satanism, however, does not mean that humanity should be eradicated. The lyrics are meant as fantasy and entertainment. Nemesis and he got to know each other in 1995, after Nemesis had founded the MLO. It was actually the man from the couple that recommended Jon to join. He had previously been a part of the Swedish organization The True Satanist Horde, that was initially a society for people with interest in the same kind of music, but it later evolved into an extremist organization. So he left the Horde and instead joined the MLO. It was after he started hanging out more regularly with Nemesis that he built the altar he has at home. As time passed, his friendship with Nemesis consumed more and more of his time, to the detriment of his music making. The band recorded an album in December in 1996 and then toured in Germany during the following spring. And after that they have basically been idle. The other members left the MLO after a while. According to Nemesis, they are now enemies. Currently, the MLO consists only of himself, Nemesis and Sarah. They have sacrificed animals several times, but mostly cats. The MLO is a brotherhood. Nemesis and he are brothers. You're always loyal to your brother and willing to die for him. Nemesis, who is the driving force in the organization and very knowledgeable, has said that he would never cooperate with police against a brother. Nemesis has taught him a lot. While they did have common interests, they did not necessarily agree on everything. Because of his income from Dissection, he was the one that contributed the most financially to the MLO. So, what does Nemesis have to say about the MLO and his relationship to Jon? For a long time, he has had strong interest in Satanism. He confesses to the satanic faith. To him, that means exploring the dark spiritualism, the left-hand path. It's not about violence, but about light and darkness. The darkness is hidden, and therefore what's interesting. He founded the MLO in 1995, together with 2 other people. It was a society for like-minded, not a sect. Then, finally, the focus of the testimonies shift onto the night of the murder. Jon and Nemesis are in agreement that they had been partying for 2 days without sleep, that he took amphetamines, drank lots of beer, and visited the exclusive strip club Chat Noir, together with the heavy metal brothers, before they parted ways. After this, however, their stories divert from each other. And according to Jon, this is how it all went down. After they separated from the heavy metal brothers, they ran into Joseph while walking towards the central parts of Gothenburg. Someone shouted "fucking fag," and Joseph asked if they were Satanists, likely because they were dressed all in black and wore Satanist symbols. He remembers them giving Joseph the fake names Mike and Thomas, but doesn't know why they did that. Joseph hopped along and wanted to talk, claiming to be interested in different religions. It was mostly Joseph and Nemesis who talked, while he himself mostly wanted to get home to get some sleep. Joseph was very sissy-like and feminine, and all 3 of them boarded a tram. He gave Joseph his sunglasses, but when Joseph wanted to put them back in his hair, he got mad. He found it very unpleasant. Joseph apologized, but shortly thereafter Joseph grabbed his hand and told him that he was handsome. He snatched away his hand, and Joseph again apologized. But now he was boiling with rage on the inside, and found it disgusting. He came close to punching Joseph there and then. When they got off to change trams, Joseph hopped along and said something to Nemesis, who seemed upset. He never saw Nemesis shove Joseph, but it could have happened. They told Joseph to fuck off, but he still kept following them. And when they reached Jon's apartment, Joseph asked to be let in. He said no to him several times, but as Joseph insisted, eventually allowed him to come in. Joseph became very happy and grabbed his hand, which again made him furious. When they stood at the entrance to the apartment, a basement apartment, Joseph suddenly seemed hesitant, and he told him to come in then for fuck's sake. But now Joseph wanted assurance that they weren't going to beat him up once inside. So he called him a fucking idiot and pointed out that it was he who wanted to talk to them and insisted to follow them around. He clearly remembers shouting fucking fag, fucking idiot, and fucking come in then. But Joseph now didn't want to enter the apartment. Instead, Joseph chose to stay outside, while he himself went in to drink some water. While inside, Jon felt an overwhelming rage, unlike anything he'd ever felt before. He wanted to beat the shit out of Joseph and threaten him. That's why he picked up the gun, but he never for a moment had any plans to kill Joseph, only to teach him a lesson. The only reason that he during police interrogations said that he at this point planned to kill Joseph was because he wanted to take the entire blame on himself and protect Nemesis. So he brought the loaded gun and the stun gun. And at this point he was willing to use the stun gun, but the real gun was only to be brought as a threat. And when he left the apartment, he told Joseph that he knew a good place where they could talk. The park. That beautiful hill atop of Gothenburg. He whispered to Nemesis that we're going to show the fucker. And by that he meant they were going to beat Joseph up. Nemesis nodded and seemed to understand what he meant. He did not show Nemesis the gun. They walked towards Ramberget while he hid his rage and therefore no longer reacted when Joseph touched his hair. They tried to teach him the mantra in nomine Dei nostri. But Joseph had trouble pronouncing it right, so they jokingly nicknamed Joseph Destri. Eventually they reached the viewing spot on the hill, but chose to continue towards the plateau with the water tower since that spot was more secluded. As Joseph hopped around and enjoyed the view, Jon now felt his rage subside and now just felt awkward about the entire situation. But when Nemesis asked what they were going to do with the idiot, Jon gave him the stun gun and said, "Let's show the guy." Nemesis then took the stun gun and tased Joseph. When Joseph began fighting back, swinging his handbag at Nemesis, Jon wrestled Joseph to the ground. While he was sitting on top of Joseph, who was lying on his back, the gun fell out of his pants and landed on the ground next to Joseph. Nemesis instantly picked it up and pointed it towards Joseph. Jon now felt that things were suddenly spiraling out of control. But they asked Joseph why he kept making fun of them, to which Joseph replied that he wasn't. He was serious about his interest in them and in Satanism. Nemesis cocked the gun and instructed Joseph to stand up. As Joseph rose to his feet, Jon did not think that Nemesis would shoot, although he couldn't rule it out completely. He backed away from Nemesis and Joseph, suddenly overwhelmed by feelings of derealization. As Joseph made a run for it down the slope, Nemesis pursued and then stopped to fire the gun at Joseph. Jon ran forwards to see what had happened, and at the bottom of the slope he saw Joseph lying motionless in a pool of blood. He rushed down to Joseph and remembers standing there looking at him until he yelled for Nemesis to come down. Nemesis then came down to them, and as Jon covered his ears with his hands, Nemesis put the gun against Joseph's head and fired the gun one more time. Jon did nothing to stop Nemesis. Some time after the killing, Nemesis told him that the murder could be viewed as a sacrifice to Satan, but he thinks that that was probably only Nemesis' way of justifying what had happened, because in reality Nemesis did not feel well at all. Nemesis also told him that he should remember Destri if he ever considered turning on him. So that's what Jon said during the examination of him as a defendant. Did Nemesis agree with Jon about any of this? Well, he also describes how Joseph kept following them around despite them telling him to fuck off. The overall story is similar until they get to the viewing spot in the park. According to him, they just went there to drink some beer. John tried to teach Joseph the Latin phrase and, despite having told Joseph to fuck off several times, now actually seemed to be in a good mood. He and John then walked the last part of the way without Joseph and then sat down to drink some beer with amphetamine. That's when Joseph came up and sat down next to John and from nowhere started hitting John with his handbag. He stood up and readied the stun gun, then used it 3 times on Joseph. But Joseph kept attacking, so he stunned him 1 more time. Joseph now turned to attack him, and after backing up, he fell down and lay on the ground for half a minute. Joseph kept flailing his arms and stomping his foot beside him. That's when he heard a loud bang and watched how Joseph stumbled forwards and past him, while he himself was laying on the ground. Joseph had been shot in the back. John ran forwards and Nemesis heard another shot. He saw the first shot, but John told him also that he had shot Joseph in the head the second time. The only reason he got involved at all was because Joseph attacked John. He later found out that Joseph had continued groping John and that is how the fight started. The killing was not planned and had nothing to do with Satanism. They only said so afterwards as an attempt to justify what had happened to themselves because they did not feel well at all. He told Sarah about it some weeks later, but without mentioning any details, like who fired the gun. And then it's time for Sarah to explain what she claims to have heard about the actual murder. She describes how when they saw the show Wanted, Nemesis called John and asked him to come over. The guys then took out the gun, cleaned it and put it away. Nemesis then told her that they had been partying, met Joseph who kept hitting on John and also followed them around. Nemesis also told her that he used the stun gun, after which Joseph tried to run away. But then Sarah can't make up her mind. She keeps changing her story, but finally says that she heard that Joseph was shot twice, and that Nemesis and John each fired a shot, although she isn't sure of the order of these shots. They also told her that there had not been any ritual or Satanist intentions with the murder. Finally, the last witness during the main hearing is the forensic expert. He performed the autopsy and took part in the test shooting of the gun. He makes the following case. It's not possible to say with absolute confidence which of the wounds came first, but the most likely explanation is that the one in the back preceded the one in the head. Based on the findings on Joseph and his clothes, the headshot appears to have been fired at a very close range. The back shot must have been fired from a somewhat further distance, but still not very far away. The shot to the back blew the heart to pieces and caused immediate death. After that, no coordinated or controlled bodily movements can have been possible, although some automatic body movements could still have happened. At the very most, the body could have managed to take 2 additional steps after the bullet exploded Joseph's heart. There is a superficial wound on the left leg that was likely caused by the shot to the back, and that the body at that time was probably hunched down a bit on its way down the slope. The shot to the back thus passed downwards through the body and the spinal column, after which is likely changed direction slightly to the left. And that is the summary of what was said during the oral examinations at the main hearing. So, what do you think the court made out of all this? Well, it reasons as follows. To begin with, it doesn't really buy Nemesis' story that they went to the park to drink some beer. The reason being that the court doesn't think it makes any sense that they would have expected to be left alone by Joseph, who had been so clingy from the moment they met him. So the court notes initially that Nemesis doesn't seem very trustworthy in his story. John, on the other hand, has described details that put himself in a bad light. For example, by explaining how he brought the stun gun and the pistol to the park in order to teach Joseph a lesson. So the court is already from the beginning more inclined to believe that John's version is closer to the truth and states that it finds it proven The Nemesis and Jon were tired and angry with Joseph and had the intentions to bring him to the secluded spot on the hill to threaten him or beat him up. But it's not proven that they at this point had any plan to murder Joseph. As for Joseph's death, the court finds that evidence show that Joseph was first shot in the back from a slightly upwards angle from about 2 meters distance. The court finds that the bullet passed downwards through his body, caused a wound on his left thigh on the way out, while Joseph was crouching down. After that, Joseph was shot in the back of the head when he was lying on the ground. Furthermore, it notes the following. The body was found laying in a straight manner, around 3 meters south of the water tower, pointing downwards from the slope. The grass in the slope above had been pushed down. Based on the evidence, the body cannot have rolled down the slope or have been moved after Joseph was killed. Therefore, the spot where Joseph was found is also where he must have fallen to the ground after the first shot was fired. That means that Joseph was hunched down at the bottom of the slope when he was shot the first time. He fell forwards and landed on his stomach and was then shot in the head. The court points out that Jon and Nemesis gave their first accounts of the events in police interrogations before knowing anything about the result of the investigation on the scene. And despite that, Jon's story appears fully coherent with the results of the forensic investigation, while Nemesis' version doesn't make any sense, neither in regards to where the body fell, how the bullet passed through the body, or the position the body must have been in when the first shot was fired. But Jon's and Sarah's stories are also coherent with each other, while neither of them fits with Nemesis' version. The court reiterates that Nemesis claimed that Joseph was standing up and kicking him, while he himself was lying down when the first shot was fired. And the court finds that it's very unlikely that Joseph would even have dared to attack Jon at any point. When Joseph saw the gun, it is far more likely that he ran away rather than charge against Jon. Furthermore, the idea that Nemesis, who is trained in martial arts, would not have been able to defend himself against the more smallish-built Joseph is not very credible. So the court continues. One can wonder why Nemesis, even after confronted with the full evidence, presents a story that he must understand is not compatible with the technical and forensical evidence of the scene. It might be that he simply has poor memories now, as he clearly has told Sarah another version earlier, one that is compatible with both the forensical evidence and with Jon's version. The only possible explanation is that Nemesis has lied intentionally about what transpired. His accounts therefore are neither credible nor reliable, while Jon's story, on the other hand, is supported by other evidence in such a way that it deserves credence. But leaving aside until later the question of who fired the gun, the court finds that the following has been established by the evidence. At the hill in the park, Nemesis immediately attacked Joseph with a stun gun. Joseph attempted to defend himself with his handbag. Jon then shoved Joseph to the ground and held him down. He was threatened that he was not to mock neither them nor Satanism. He was then let go and allowed to stand up, while the gun was being pointed towards him. He stood for several seconds at the upper plateau, a couple of steps from the edge. The person holding the gun was standing a couple of meters further away from the slope on the plateau. Suddenly Joseph turned around and rushed down the slope. The shooter rushed after him and shot him in the back when he was at the lower part of the slope, just above the wall. Joseph fell forwards and ended up lying beneath the wall. There he was shot again in the back of the head. But who fired the gun? Just because Jon has been shown to be more reliable about what transpired and Nemesis has been found unreliable, that doesn't mean that Jon's accounts of who held the gun should automatically be accepted as true. However, it does give his story more weight than Nemesis. Although Jon's account is not in itself enough evidence that it was Nemesis who fired the gun, because it would still be natural if Jon, just like Nemesis, just wanted to say something to get off as lightly as possible. Jon has in police interrogations described the same sequence of events, first with Nemesis, then with himself, and then finally with Nemesis again as the sole gunman. He is given an explanation as to why he changed his story like that, and this is an explanation that just can't be disregarded. Both Jon's and Nemesis' actions during the investigation must be viewed in the light of the very special relationship they have to each other. Membership in the MLO has united them in brotherhood with demands of undying loyalty, which no doubt has affected their actions. This loyalty demands that they stick up for each other beyond what is expected in a normal friendship. With that background taken into consideration, Jon's earlier confession makes sense. That he in a convincing manner described how he carried out the murder is not the least weird, as he was at the scene and had time to prepare for the interrogation with the aim of appearing convincing. Nemesis, on the other hand, has from the beginning said as little as possible and never confessed to more than he has been forced to in light of progress made during the investigation. Jon has always been willing to place some of the blame on himself, while Nemesis has consistently tried to avoid any responsibility for the murder. Much of what Nemesis has claimed has also been found to not be reliable. Apart from Jon's and Nemesis' accounts, there is also the testimony from Sarah. In her first 3 interrogations, she said to 3 different interrogation officers that Nemesis fired the first shot. About Jon, she said in the first interrogation that he fired the second shot. But then she gradually grew more and more uncertain of whether he really fired the gun, or if Nemesis only encouraged him to take the gun so that his fingerprints would also be on the weapon. From Sarah's testimony at the trial, it is evident that she has done everything she can to protect Nemesis from the charges of threat and assault against her. But regarding the murder, she has maintained, despite her loyalty towards Nemesis, the testimony she had given previously. Even if she exaggerated the violence that Nemesis subjected her to, her accounts of what happened in the park do not seem exaggerated at all. It can also be noted that her testimony is compatible both with Jon's and with the forensic evidence. Both Jon and Nemesis were present when Nemesis told her what happened. That Nemesis in front of Jon should lie to Sarah to impress her does not seem likely. Sarah's testimony, even if it is hearsay, should therefore be given great value as evidence. What Jon has described is therefore supported by Sarah's testimony in such a way that it is proven that Nemesis fired at least the first shot. Sarah is unsure of who fired the second one, and the court finds that it is not possible on the basis of the evidence to say who did. We move now to how the court reasons when it comes to the question of criminal liability. Should Jon and Nemesis be convicted of murder? And the court writes as follows. The court has found that there is no evidence for a common plan to kill Joseph, or that there had been any deliberation about anything other than some sort of violence directed towards him. The court neither finds any evidence that the killing was a sacrifice to Satan or had ritual elements. At the plateau, Nemesis has received the gun in his hand. He has pointed it towards Joseph and realized, even if he didn't load the gun himself, that it was loaded with real ammunition. It was a gun that he was familiar with. He then ran after Joseph and shot him in the back at a close distance. He must have realized that such a shot could kill Joseph. In fact, the shot caused Joseph's immediate death, and the court finds that Nemesis fired the gun with the intention to kill Joseph. As for Jon, he should be held responsible at the very least, if not more, according to his own story. The court accepts Jon's story and assesses his guilt based on the supposition that Nemesis fired both shots. So, Jon has been ready to commit violence against Joseph when they went up the hill. This readiness has included the use of some form of weapon. He has been prepared for a double attack by bringing 2 guns, and he was in a furious state of mind. That he, when he gave the stun gun to Nemesis and then helped wrestle Joseph down, had the intention to kill him is not proven. But when he saw Nemesis point the gun and cock it, he must have understood what could happen. He has explained that he didn't think Nemesis would shoot, but also admitted that he wasn't sure. And instead of trying to stop Nemesis from using the gun, he backed away to avoid having the gun pointed towards himself. This indicates that he thought the gun would be fired. Letting the gun that he brought to the scene come to use without protesting must have been perceived by Nemesis as moral support and approval to use the gun. And then, when Joseph fell, Jon still didn't try to take the gun or in any way protest. Instead, he let Nemesis, the gun still in hand, come down to Joseph and then just silently stood there when another shot was fired, this time in Joseph's head. Jon's own story shows that he, especially regarding the second shot, was completely indifferent towards Joseph's life. That Joseph was already beyond saving was nothing that Jon could have been sure of. So the court finds that Jon has assisted the deed by enabling it by means of solidarizing himself with Nemesis and thus strengthening Nemesis in his intent. Jon must have realized this. Jon has not participated in such an active manner that he shall be convicted as co-perpetrator. Instead, he shall be convicted for aiding and abetting the murder. Even if the killing wasn't planned in advance, it was still a brutal execution. Joseph has been brought to a secluded place where Jon and Nemesis intended to hurt him. He has been completely defenseless against his two assailants. The killing, therefore, cannot be considered to be of a lesser degree. Nemesis shall therefore be convicted of murder, and Jon for aiding and abetting murder. Now, before the sentencing, the court looks into the personal circumstances of the defendants, so let's look at some of the highlights of what was mentioned in the reports. Nemesis. He was born in Iran, but has been living in Sweden for close to 15 years. His dad is Greek and German, while his mother is Persian. The parents are not religious, and he came with his mother to Sweden, during which his parents split up. He was 5 years old at the time, and claims to not remember anything from that time. He lived in Kiruna and later in Luleå, where he was also primarily raised. He has no contact with his parents anymore, but considers his childhood good. He doesn't have any plans for the future, but thinks that maybe he could have a job where he doesn't have to meet large crowds of people, because he can't stand that. People do stare at him, but that's because of his tattoos and clothing. But he is definitely not the one looking for trouble. Instead, he thinks that it's possible to hurt one's enemies mentally through spiritual sessions. But his mother thinks that Satanism is just childish play. His interest in Satanism has the goal of receiving knowledge, not so much to practice it. For the last 9 months, he has had a girlfriend, Sarah, and they are awaiting their first child. This girlfriend and the coming child is the only thing that he has to look forward to in life. It is the only thing that keeps him above the surface. It is true that he has previously said that he doesn't want children because it was against his beliefs, but today he is actually very happy that he is about to have a child. His girlfriend also gives him the strength to live. His so-called brothers used to mean the world to him, and once upon a time he could have died for them, but now they mean nothing. Everything they had was built on lies. He doesn't have a leading role among the Satanists, but people do respect him because he has acquired so much knowledge, while others have been out drinking. He is against drugs and everything that makes man weak. In the summary, the correctional authority described Nemesis as a man who requires a lot of support and help, as he is unsure of his role in society and has a lot of existential questions, which has led him to extreme groups such as Satanists. And after the forensic psychiatric evaluation, he is deemed not to be criminally insane. And now let's look at what the correctional authority had to say about Jon. Jon grew up in Strömstad, that's a small Swedish town close to the Norwegian border, together with a brother and sister. Both his parents are middle school teachers. He moved out in 1992 at the age of 17 to study at pre-college, but soon quit school to focus entirely on his music. During the autumn of 1993, he moved to Gothenburg and united with the rest of the members of his band Dissection. The band had done so well that they were able to live off their music. The music is partly satanic, and Jon considers himself to be a Satanist, although not in the Christian sense, where Satan represents evil. For Jon, Satan is more of an existential and philosophical symbol of chaos. He does not consider himself to have neither physical nor mental health issues. Jon's parents were also interviewed by the correctional authority, and they had the following to say about their son. From when Jon was just a few weeks old until he was 15, they lived in a house by the sea, and after that they moved into town. As a child, Jon played football, tennis, undertook ice skating and skiing, and went to the mountains with his grandparents. He received his musical interest from home, as music has always been a central part of the family life. He learned to play guitar with his father from 4 years of age, and later went to music school. His brother Emil Nödtveidt also plays music, and the two brothers did even play music together for some time. Jon was always a person who was eager for things to happen, and if no one else made them happen, he would do it himself. Through his musical interest, he had many contacts, as evident by the fact that he, after one vacation in England when Jon was 15, had 50 letters waiting for him when they came home. When Jon moved to another town to go to high school, he didn't really like it there, but it was difficult for him to say it out loud, and it was buried deep within him. But when he finally broke down crying, they understood that he wanted to move back home and that he didn't like to live alone as a 17-year-old. Jon is a kind and happy person, but sometimes they wonder if maybe he just appears happy on the outside and carries so much within himself. They recall how, when Jon was a child and became upset, he always hid behind the garage or locked himself in his room to cry alone. They always had to go and get him to comfort him. His brother, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, always loud and yelling when he got upset. During his teenage years, Jon rarely followed his friends when they went out to drink and party. Instead, he often went home to make music. In its summary, the correctional authority concludes that Jon does not seem to have any mental or personal disturbances that require him to be handed over to psychiatric care. Instead, they describe Jon as an interested and engaged musician who is somewhat careful and reserved in his manners. And after a forensic psychiatric evaluation, he was deemed not to be criminally insane. And after the review of the personal reports, the court hands down the sentence. Nemesis receives 10 years for murder, while Jon receives 8 years for assisting murder. But the prosecutor files an appeal, after which the Court of Appeal in Gothenburg increases the punishment for Jon to 10 years. And that concludes this case. My spontaneous reflection on this judgment is that it, all in all, is fairly well written. The court presents a logical chain of reasoning that strings together in such a way that we can understand how it reached its conclusion. Now, this is not going to be yet another Varje Vikenes video, but I can't help but compare this judgment to the one where he was convicted of murdering Euronymous. Maybe I am biased towards the Swedish style of writing, but I do think that the court has to explain in a country that has the rule of law. The court has to explain how it arrives at its conclusion in a way that makes sense. How else is a defendant going to be able to understand why he was convicted? Or how else will an injured party understand why the perpetrator walked free? In order for people to trust the legal system, the court's judgments must display that the decisions are founded upon rational grounds and include an objective and structured analysis of all the available evidence. And speaking about the case where Euronymous was killed, I have another thought about the comparison between these cases, because from the first time reading about that case, I always felt, as awful as this might sound, that Euronymous' death was the logical culmination of what he himself had created and set in motion, and the decisions he made. It never bothered me personally. But with this case, there is an element of tragedy to it, because the whole thing seems so meaningless. We have this Algerian guy who comes off as almost a bit mentally challenged. He kept following and hitting on these black metal guys, despite him telling him to fuck off repeatedly and just wanting to be left alone. And then for some reason it all spiraled out of control, and they pretty much executed him. And it all just seems so stupid and unnecessary, for the murder and the prison sentences, they didn't achieve anything. Now, in the judgment, we have already learned about 2 different versions about Joseph's untimely demise, but there is actually a third version. It's not an official story, but I do believe it is the true story. Every now and then, I'm contacted by people who were involved in the black metal scene at the time. And one such person who knew Jon told me that Jon told him after he got out of prison what really happened. And this is how it went down. Yes, Jon and Nemesis had both been partying for days. They were drunk and high on amphetamines. When they were outside of Jon's apartment, Nemesis told Jon that they were going to show Joseph what Satanism really is. And then, on the hill in the park, Nemesis fired the first shot, yes, in Joseph's back. And then he handed the gun to Jon. Jon then felt, for whatever reason, that they had passed the point of no return, that it was too late to turn back. He felt that he did not have any other choice but to finish what they had already set in motion. So he leaned over Joseph, put the gun to his head, and pulled the trigger. And that is how it really happened. But you may be wondering where all these people are now, 30 years later. Well, Nemesis and Sarah are still a couple, and they live in the Stockholm area, not far from here actually. And Jon, when he was released from prison in 2004, he revived his band Dissection with the help of 2 new band members. They released their 3rd album, Reconstruction, during the spring and played their first show called The Rebirth of Dissection in October the same year. 2 years later, Jon was found dead in his apartment. This time it was he who had taken a blast to the head. He had shot himself while sitting on the floor in a circle of lit candles, together with a satanic text next to him on the floor. And just before the suicide, Jon had told his friends that he would be out of touch for some time, as he was embarking on a longer journey. He told them that he was traveling to Transylvania, and that was the last anyone ever heard of him